April 10, 1945. The wind moved across a ruined German airfield like a ghost looking for a home. It carried the smell of burnt oil, cordite, and surrender. Along the cracked runway stood a line of German officers, grey uniforms stiff with dirt, metals dulled by defeat, eyes fixed on the horizon where the American trucks waited. These were not ordinary soldiers. They were generals. Men who once commanded tens of thousands, who signed orders that decided the lives of strangers with the flick of a pen. Now they stood silent, stripped not of rank yet, but of purpose. The war they had built their lives around was over, though no one had yet said it aloud. A US sergeant walked down the line, counting heads. Behind him, a jeep idled, its radio murmuring Glenn Miller. The sound was surreal, a cheerful American swing tune bouncing off the bones of a dead empire. The German officers exchanged glances, half disbelief, half dread. Rumor had already spread that high-ranking Nazis were being executed on the spot. One general whispered that Americans hanged prisoners at dawn. Another swore he'd bite his tongue before capture, but they were alive, and that was its own kind of confusion. When the trucks began to move, the Germans climbed aboard without protest. The wooden planks rattled under their boots. Dust rose behind them as they left the ruins of Castle. One officer, a tall man with a silver mustache, once commander of an armored corps, clutched his cap as if it might still mean something. He had fought since Poland through France through the snow of Russia. Now he sat in silence beside a man who once led a panzer division and stared at his gloved hands as though they belonged to someone else. The Americans guarding them were young, barely 20, their uniforms too big, their accents foreign music. One private offered a cigarette to a captured general. The general hesitated, thinking it a mockery, but the soldier simply said, "It's lucky strike, sir," and smiled. The cigarette was trembling between his fingers from the cold. The general took it. That small exchange felt absurdly human. By the second day, they reached the port of Le Havre. Hundreds of prisoners waited behind barbed wire, each with the same haunted stillness. On the horizon, Liberty ships rocked gently in the harbor, grey giants with American flags snapping in the sea wind. To the Germans, the sight was biblical, an ocean waiting to swallow them whole. They were told they were being taken for questioning. No one explained why the questioning required an ocean. That night, as they waited for embarkation, a thin rain fell. A young translator from the US Army, a Jewish refugee from Berlin, walked among the prisoners, checking names. Some officers looked away, unwilling to meet his eyes. Others stared too long, recognizing the cruel poetry of it. A German Jew now deciding the fates of generals who once served Hitler. The translator kept his tone formal, detached, professional. Later he wrote in his diary, they were expecting ropes. We gave them forms to fill out. When dawn came, the prisoners were herded up the gangplanks. The deck smelled of salt, steel, and oil. American sailors watched curiously. They had been told they were carrying dangerous officers, but these grey, tired men looked more like aging bureaucrats than warriors. One sailor said quietly, "Hell, they look like my high school teachers." Another laughed. "Guess the devil's army runs on coffee and metals." Below deck, bunks were stacked 3 high. The air was thick with motion and shame. Someone began humming Lily Marlene, that old song of soldiers and lost love. Within minutes, half the compartment was singing it softly, voices echoing off steel walls. An American guard listening from the corridor didn't stop them. Instead, he joined in with the English words he half remembered from the radio. The absurdity of it, a US corporal and a dozen German generals sharing a song, made one officer press his hands to his face. For the first time since the surrender, he laughed, though it came out like a sob. Days passed on the Atlantic. No one was beaten. No one starved. They were fed 3 times a day. Bread, stew, coffee. The coffee astonished them most. In the collapsing rye, even civilians were boiling acorns for imitation brew. Here the enemy served it hot, black, and endless. A few whispered that it must be a trick, some American experiment in psychology. But the guard seemed indifferent, even friendly. They spoke little of the war. Some played cards near the mess. When a storm hit the mid-Atlantic, an American sailor handed out blankets to shivering generals who could hardly believe it. One of them, an older officer with sharp blue eyes, found himself studying his captors. They were relaxed, undisciplined by Prussian standards, yet effective. He had been taught to see Americans as crude and soft, spoiled by luxury. Instead, he saw quiet confidence. They did not need to prove superiority. They simply assumed it. It was not arrogance, but something else, a moral ease that unsettled him. When they neared the American coast, the fog lifted to reveal the Statue of Liberty. For men who had seen only ruins and propaganda reels, it looked unreal. The translator told them, "Welcome to America." No one replied. The words felt like both a sentence and a salvation. As they disembarked in New York, curious dock workers stared. The generals were marched in silence to waiting trains. Along the way, they passed a billboard advertising toothpaste. A smiling woman with the caption, "A bright future needs a bright smile." The image struck one officer so strangely, he almost laughed. The country they had been taught to despise was radiant, ordinary, and untouched by war. The train doors closed. Outside, the city roared with life. Vendors shouting, horns blaring. The rhythm of a nation untouched by bombing raids. The captured men looked out through the glass, seeing not enemies, but a civilization their own leaders had promised was barbaric. Inside the car, one whispered to another, "Perhaps this is our punishment, that we must see how wrong we were." When night fell, the lights of the train windows flickered across the faces of the guards and prisoners alike. Somewhere ahead lay Mississippi, Virginia, or Texas. Names that meant nothing to the men who had once dreamed of Moscow and Paris. But in that steel carriage, something subtle began to shift. Fear was still there, but so was curiosity. The older officer removed his cap and set it on his knees. "If they wanted us dead," he murmured, "we would already be in the sea." Another nodded, staring out into the dark blur of the American countryside. None of them knew it yet. But this journey across the ocean, across pride, was the beginning of their education in defeat. And as the train curved into the vast sleeping land, one question lingered among them all. What kind of victor shows mercy to men like us? The first thing they noticed was the sunlight. It poured over the Mississippi fields like a golden tide as the train hissed to a stop, its steel wheels moaning in protest. To the captured German general staring through the barred windows, that warm light felt almost insulting, too gentle for men who expected punishment. But beyond the track stood Camp Shelby, a sprawling maze of wooden barracks, fences, and watchtowers under a sky so wide it made them dizzy. It was not a dungeon. It was not even cruel. To their disbelief, it looked clean, organized, almost peaceful. When the gates clanged open, an American officer with sunburned skin and a clipboard greeted them in crisp English. "Welcome to the United States. Gentlemen." The word gentleman stunned them more than the rifles. A few exchanged cautious glances, expecting sarcasm, yet the tone was formal, businesslike, as if they were merely visiting scholars who had taken a wrong turn. An MP guided them toward the administrative tent where each was handed a small paper tag with his name, rank, and prisoner number. The tags were neat, the handwriting careful. One German officer whispered to another, "They are treating us like officers." The reply came soft and bitter. "It is how they win." Inside the camp, the air smelled of pinewood and soap. The barracks stood in neat rows, whitewashed walls, narrow cots, and even curtains on the windows. Beyond the wire, they saw vegetable gardens, a canteen, and an open field where men were playing baseball. The sound of laughter drifted faintly across the yard. For men who had watched Europe burn, that sound was unbearable. The Americans called it humane treatment. The Germans called it confusion. In Europe, prisoners vanished into basements, were shot on roadsides, or starved in transit. Here at Camp Shelby, they were given medical exams, inoculations, and dental care. Their uniforms were laundered. Meals were regular with bread, meat, and even dessert. An American sergeant cheerfully explained the Geneva Convention articles that guaranteed their rights. When a general asked if this was propaganda, the sergeant grinned. "Propaganda is cheaper than steak, sir, but this is the real deal." That night, the generals sat in their bunks listening to crickets and distant jazz from a guardhouse radio. A man who had commanded an entire panzer army in France stared at his meal tray. Mashed potatoes, carrots, a slice of pie, and whispered, "My men starved in the Ardennes. The enemy feeds me pie." His bunkmate replied, "This is their revenge. They are showing us civilization." Over the next weeks, transport trucks scattered prisoners across the American heartland. Camps appeared like small contained worlds. Camp Concordia in Kansas, Camp Swift in Texas, Camp Shanks in New York. Each was built to the same pattern, order without cruelty. More than 370,000 German PS would live behind those fences by war's end. Most were ordinary soldiers, but among them were over 2,000 officers, some still clinging to their pride like a uniform that no longer fit. At Fort Hunt, Virginia, known only by its code name, P.O. Box 1142, the most senior officers were interrogated. But there were no beatings, no shouting. Instead, German-speaking Americans, many of them refugees from Hitler's Germany, asked questions politely over coffee. One interrogator, a young man from Vienna, later said, "Our job was to make them talk, not to make them hate us." It worked. The generals expecting violence found themselves lowering their defenses over civilized conversation. One afternoon, an American officer asked a general about tank production. The general answered in detail, then paused. "Why do you treat us so well?" The officer shrugged. "Because we can afford to." The answer lingered like smoke in the air. Simple, confident, and devastating daily life inside the camps blurred the line between enemy and guest. The prisoners organized orchestras, lectures, and even newspapers. At Camp Tonkawa, Oklahoma, they built a small theater and performed Faust. Local Americans attended, applauding politely. On Sundays, ministers came to preach, and even the generals attended, not out of faith, but curiosity. Some were moved to tears by the hymns. A few resisted the strange kindness. General K, a rigid Prussian traditionalist, refused to speak to his captives, convinced the politeness was a trap. But his resolve faltered one morning when an American medic saved the life of a wounded German sergeant who had been ill since France. The general stood by helplessly as the young medic worked for hours. When the man survived, the general saluted the medic silently. Later, he confessed to his diary. The enemy followed his duty better than many of us did. There were moments of absurd humor, too. At Camp Shelby, one officer complained that the food was too salty. The kitchen sergeant, baffled, handed him a suggestion form. "We'll pass it along to the cooks," he said. The German filled it out carefully, signing with his rank and regiment. It was never ignored. The next week, the soup was milder. The same man once demanded to see the camp's commandant. When told the commander was a 26-year-old lieutenant, he stared at the young man in disbelief before muttering, "This empire is built by children." Outside the fences, American farmers saw opportunity. Prisoners were sent to pick cotton, cut timber, or harvest wheat. They earned 80 cents a day in canteen coupons and sometimes shared meals with local families. One Kansas farmer later recalled, "They'd sit on my porch after work drinking lemonade. One of them told me he'd never seen so much food wasted in his life." That same man returned home after the war and told his wife, "The Americans fight wars like gentlemen. Perhaps that is why they win them." Still, the humiliation of defeat lingered. The generals met each evening in their separate quarters, debating whether this treatment was genuine or psychological warfare. "Mercy is the most effective interrogation," one admitted quietly. "We would have broken sooner under kindness than under whips." Some suspected the Americans were trying to re-educate them to make them admire democracy. If so, the method was insidious and effective. As summer stretched on, the camps grew quieter. The fences stood more as symbols than barriers. Escape attempts were rare. Many prisoners admitted there was nowhere to go. Some began writing to their families describing the kindness they couldn't explain. The letters were censored, but still carried a strange warmth. One wrote, "They defeated us without hate." Another said simply, "Here, the enemy looks you in the eyes." By autumn, word of the American camps reached Germany through the Red Cross. Families were stunned to learn that their captured sons were healthy, even gaining weight. The propaganda machine, which had painted America as brutal and degenerate, fell silent on the subject. Inside the Reich, civilians whispered that perhaps the Allies were not monsters after all. For the generals, the shock went deeper. Each day behind those fences chipped away at their certainty about superiority, about discipline, about what strength really meant. The world they had fought to preserve, the one of iron will and racial destiny, seemed smaller now, almost childish, compared to the quiet confidence of a nation that served its prisoners pie and coffee. One evening, an American guard noticed an old general sitting outside his barrack, staring at the sunset beyond the wire. "What are you thinking about, sir?" the guard asked. The man hesitated before answering. "That may be mercy as a weapon, too." The guard didn't reply. The crickets began again, and the light faded into gold. Far away, new trains were already bringing more prisoners. More men about to learn that kindness could wound more deeply than cruelty ever did. Mornings began with the clang of the mess bell, the sound rolling across the camp like an order no one could disobey. The generals rose at the same hour each day, boots polished by habit, collars straight, even when the starch had worn away. For men who once commanded divisions, routine was both comfort and punishment. The war outside was finished. But here, inside the fences, another war began. The quiet one between pride and reflection. The barracks of Camp Clinton in Mississippi were alive with small noises. The scraping of chairs, the hiss of boiling coffee, the low hum of conversation that always fell silent when the guards passed. Every morning, General Friedrich, a former staff officer on the Eastern Front, set up his chessboard on a wooden crate near the window. Across from him sat Colonel Weber, who had once believed in the Reich's destiny as surely as in gravity. Now they played in silence, the pieces moving like echoes of strategy long rendered useless. Friedrich called it our new front. Each game lasted hours, not because of complexity, but because neither could bear to lose again. Outside the camp pulsed with life. Prisoners worked in the gardens, fixed fences, built benches from scrapwood. The Americans allowed them to manage their own order. Something astonishing in itself. They held lectures on engineering, politics, even literature. A few generals spoke about Clausewitz, but others more quietly about guilt. Some of the younger officers listened, their expressions caught between awe and unease. As the heat rose, an orchestra began to rehearse in the recreation hall. Violins salvaged from donations, drums made from barrels. Their music drifted through the air, blending with the buzz of seekers. One afternoon they played Bach, and for a moment even the guards leaned on their rifles and listened. A sergeant whispered, "Hell, they play better than our radio." The camp for that instant felt more like a forgotten college than a prison. By autumn, the generals had created routines that mimicked order but hid emptiness. They formed choirs, built model hips, debated politics, and whispered tones. The Americans encouraged it, knowing idleness bred despair. Yet within that civility lay a growing unease because kindness gave them time to think. At night, when the floodlights burned pale over the wire, conversations grew more honest. The same men who once toasted victory now questioned its meaning. "We were taught we fought for culture," one said, his voice trembling. "But what culture burns children alive in Dresden?" Another replied bitterly, "Ours didn't, theirs did." But even that defense collapsed under the weight of conscience. The camps had become laboratories of reflection. Letters from home arrived each week, most written on rough grey paper, the ink smudged by tears or rain. They spoke of cities and ruins, of wives lost, of children growing up in hunger. Reading them, the generals realized that while they had been spared death, they had not escaped judgment. "The people hate us," said Colonel Weber, folding a letter with shaking hands. "They say we fled to luxury while they starved." Friedrich answered quietly, "They are right to hate. We served an idea that devoured them." There were moments when pride tried to rise again. Some prisoners still addressed each other by rank, clicking their heels at attention. But the pretense faltered whenever the Americans treated them with unshakable politeness. It was hard to believe in superiority when the man guarding you offered you extra rations. "They treat us as equals," one officer remarked, "because they no longer fear us." A Sunday service changed everything. A local pastor visited, offering communion to whoever wished to attend. The small wooden chapel filled with sunlight and silence. When the pastor read, "Blessed are the merciful," a general who had commanded a death squad in Poland stood and walked out. He sat outside on the steps for hours, staring at his hands. Later that evening, he asked the camp chaplain for confession. It was the first time he had spoken of guilt aloud. Across the camp, a new sound began to echo each evening. The choir. Dozens of German voices, rich and disciplined, rose from the mess hall in harmonies that turned dusk into something almost holy. They sang a Maria in Silent Night, songs stripped of nationalism, reduced to human longing. "Guards and prisoners alike stood still," one American lieutenant later said. "For the first time I pied them." Among the guards was Private Allen, a farmer's son from Iowa. He had lost 2 cousins at Normandy, but felt no hatred for the men behind the wire. He often walked the perimeter at dusk, stopping to talk with Friedrich about crops, chess, and home. One evening, he said, "You know, General, I thought I'd hate you, but you sound like my father." Friedrich smiled faintly. "Your father must be very stubborn." Allen chuckled. "He is, and he's alive. That's all that matters." When Allen left for the night, Friedrich remained at the fence looking at the horizon. He would later write in his journal, "The enemy sees me as a man, that is harder to bear than seeing me as a monster." As winter came, snow fell over the camp, softening the wire into silver lines. The prisoners built small Christmas trees from pine branches and painted ornaments out of tin cans. On Christmas Eve, the orchestra played before a packed hall, Americans, Germans, guards, and prisoners together. They ended with still an act. When the final note faded, no one applauded. Some wept silently. That night, a general wrote to his wife, "Our enemies have given us what our leaders could not, peace of conscience." But peace was fragile. A few officers, unable to bear the collapse of their ideology, withdrew into bitterness. They whispered that this American kindness was only a trick to make them soft before interrogation. One even attempted escape only to surrender himself the next morning shivering and ashamed. He told the guards, "I realized there is nowhere to run from defeat." The Americans didn't punish him. They gave him coffee and sent him back to work detail. Life went on. Choirs rehearsed, chessboards filled with silent wars, and confessions multiplied. Each day blurred into the next, measured not by violence, but by thought. The camp had become a mirror, forcing every man to confront what he saw when uniforms no longer mattered. When spring returned, a Red Cross representative visited and declared the conditions exemplary. The general stood at attention as the Americans translated the praise. It was meant as acknowledgement, but it sounded like irony. They had once ruled through fear. Now they were being congratulated for good behavior. That night, under a pale moon, Friedrich found himself unable to sleep. He walked outside past the empty guard towers and listened to the faint music still rising from the mess hall. The choir was singing again, softer this time, the words almost lost to the wind. He closed his eyes and realized the melody was no longer about loss. It was about forgiveness. He looked toward the gate, wondering what would happen when it finally opened. Would they walk out better men or merely quieter ones? He thought of the farmer's son from Iowa, of the medic who saved the sergeant, of the coffee in the chessboard and the songs. Perhaps this was the real battlefield now, not between nations, but within the soul. And as the last note of a Maria vanished into the night air, Friedrich whispered to himself, "We have been conquered twice, once by arms, and once by decency." Spring 1946 arrived like an exhale after years of holding breath. The war was over, but for the men behind the barbed wire, the quiet was almost more unnerving than the gunfire that had ended it. At Camp Clinton, the German generals received orders one morning that preparations for repatriation had begun. Trucks would come in 2 weeks to take them to the coast. Then ships would return them to a homeland they no longer recognized. The news rippled through the camp like wind through tall grass, soft, uncertain, and laced with dread. General Friedrich sat on the edge of his bunk, turning the paper in his hands. For months he had dreamed of home, of the Rhine, of his wife, of the smell of rain on cobblestone streets. But now that freedom was promised, the word itself felt foreign. Home was rubble, and he was no longer the man who had left it. Across the room, Colonel Weber packed his meager belongings with military precision, folding even the issued socks as though they were orders being obeyed. "It's strange," he murmured, "to leave captivity and feel like we're abandoning safety." Friedrich said nothing. He was thinking of what awaited them. Trials, suspicion, perhaps scorn. Freedom, he realized, was not the same as forgiveness. In the last days before departure, the camp seemed to breathe differently. The guards were relaxed, even friendly. The Germans were allowed to walk outside the perimeter under supervision. Some took to sketching the fields or writing poetry and notebooks made from ration paper. Others simply stood watching the sun rise over the pines as if trying to memorize what decency looked like. The Americans, perhaps sensing the moment, treated them with even more care. They offered cigarettes, photographs, even handshakes. One morning, Private Allen, the farmer's son from Iowa, found Friedrich sitting by the fence. "You'll be heading home soon," Allen said. "You must be glad." Friedrich looked up slowly. "Glad, yes," he replied, "and ashamed that I'm alive when better men are dead." Allen hesitated. "Maybe that's why you're alive. To do something different with what's left." The general studied the young soldier, then nodded once. "Perhaps that is the first order I can still follow." At night, the camp was restless. Some men drank the last of their canteen whiskey. Others argued about the future of Germany, whether it would stand again or disappear into occupation. The radio in the guardhouse played quietly, broadcasting news of the Nuremberg trials. The names were familiar. Göring Keitel-Jodl. Ghosts of authority now stripped bare in a courtroom. When one of the younger officers asked whether they would also be tried, Friedrich answered. Not for crimes perhaps, but for conscience. The morning of departure came under a grey sky. Trucks lined up beyond the gate, their engines rumbling low like a reminder of the world waiting outside. The prisoners filed out carrying small duffel bags and folded blankets. Each shook hands with their American guards, a ritual both solemn and absurd. The same men who had been called monsters now thanked their captives for decency. One officer saluted, another crossed himself. When Friedrich reached the gate, he turned once more toward the camp. The choir was singing again, faint but clear. The same song that had carried through the winter, still enough. It was spring, yet the melody still felt like a prayer for the dead. The trucks moved through the countryside, passing farms and towns untouched by war. Children waved from porches. One old man in overalls tipped his hat. For the prisoners, these glimpses of normal life were more humbling than defeat itself. They saw a nation that had not been bombed, that had not burned its cities to ashes, and yet had still managed to conquer the most dangerous army on earth. Colonel Weber whispered, "They have won without losing themselves." At the port, Liberty ships waited once more, their hulls rusted, but sturdy. The same ocean that had carried them into captivity now promised return. But as the men climbed the gangplanks, the mood was heavier than it had been on arrival. The Americans handed out Red Cross parcels, chocolate, cigarette, soap, and wished them luck. "Go rebuild your country," one sergeant said. "Maybe this time start with kindness." The words landed like a benediction and a challenge at once. During the voyage home, the sea was calm, but the minds aboard were not. The generals gathered on deck in the evenings, staring at the water that stretched endlessly toward Europe. Friedrich found himself unable to sleep. He kept remembering the American soldier who had saved a dying German sergeant. The farmer who shared lemonade with his captives, the boy from Iowa who spoke like a philosopher. Each memory gnawed at the old scaffolding of pride. He realized that somewhere between surrender and departure, the enemy had taught him the meaning of victory. A week later, the coast of France appeared through mist, a shoreline of ruin and resurrection. As they disembarked, Allied officers handed each man papers confirming his release. Some kissed the ground. Others wept silently. The air smelled of coal smoke and salt. A few civilians watched from a distance, whispering. No one cheered. These were not heroes returning, but men marked by the war's shadow. When Friedrich reached Germany, the landscape broke his heart. Cities were flattened, rail lines twisted like wire, children scavenging through rubble for food. His home in Cologne was gone. In its place stood a crater filled with rainwater. He stood there for hours holding a handful of broken bricks. The neighbors recognized him, but said nothing. What could they say to a man who had served the Reich? That night, he slept in a church basement, the same church where he had once been baptized. Weeks later, a letter arrived from America. It was from Private Allen. The handwriting was uneven, but the words were clear. I hope you made it home safe, sir. I'm back on my farm. We're planting corn this week. I sometimes think about those evenings you taught me chess. I beat my father now. Guess you did win something after all. Friedrich folded the letter and placed it in his coat pocket. For the first time in months, he smiled. The following Sunday, he walked to the local schoolhouse where displaced children gathered for lessons. The teacher, a weary widow, recognized him and hesitated. He said simply, I used to teach strategy. Perhaps I could teach arithmetic instead. She nodded, unsure what to make of him. As the children filed in, Friedrich took a piece of chalk and began writing numbers on the board. Outside, church bells rang faintly, blending with the sound of laughter, a fragile sound, but real. Years later, when he was asked by a historian what captivity in America had meant to him, Friedrich replied, it was where I stopped being a general and started being a man. He paused, then added, they conquered us without cruelty. That is a harder kind of victory to live with, but also the only kind worth remembering. And as he looked at the young interviewer who had never seen war, he smiled again. Perhaps, he said softly, the war truly ended not when we laid down our weapons, but when we learned to look our enemies in the eyes and saw human beings looking back.